Every week, I feel like our musicians and our volunteers do such a great job. But occasionally, it does feel like a different spirit in the room. And this morning was one of those for me. I don't know if it was one of those for you, but occasionally it feels like we are a shade closer to heaven on earth. And so I am grateful for our musicians this morning who their job is, in a lot of ways, to get out of the way and usher God's people into the presence of God. That's what they do. That's why they show up every week. And I'm grateful for that. Appreciate y'all. I can't see you, but I assume you're somewhere in here. So thanks for doing that this morning. My name is Matt Stone. I'm one of the pastors. Well, sure. Yeah. It's worthy of that, you bet. My name is Matt Stone. I'm one of the pastors here, and as always, I'm honored to be in worship with you today. I'm excited about this message. I'm excited about what we're going to talk about this morning because it stands at the intersection of Lent and who we are as a church. That's what we're talking about today, the intersection of Lent and who we are as a church. If you're not familiar with Lent, Lent is an incredible season, and I can't say it enough. For many of us, we're not familiar with Lent because we didn't grow up in the church or we didn't grow up in the Catholic Church, and so we're not terribly familiar with Lent. So I want to give you just a few notes about what Lent is because it is crucial to our relationship with Jesus, I believe. Lent is a season of preparation for Easter. It's the 46 days. It's 40 days plus the 6 Sundays, 46 days leading up to Easter that the church sets aside to get ready. Because we don't want to show up on Easter Sunday morning having never thought about what Easter is and what it means and what that means for our lives. So we set up this season of preparation. It's a season of self-examination. It's a season of penitence. It's a season to say, here's where I perhaps have strayed from who God made me to be, and here's my commitment to return. That's the process of repentance. Here's my commitment to return to who God made me to be. That's an incredibly important season. But Protestants got away from it, right? Protestants don't know what Catholics have known for generations, that this is an intensely spiritual season, that if we skip it, if we just don't pay attention to it, we're the worst off for it. Not because it's a formal ritual, not because it's a dead liturgy, but because it possesses power to turn the hearts of God's people back to Christ. That's what the opportunity is, and I can't be passionate enough about it. It's been around for forever, or at least almost forever, right? So as early as the 2nd century, about 110 years after Jesus dies and is resurrected, we see the first instance of Lent. It's a season of preparation for those who were about to be baptized, but it was only like 2 or 3 days, and it took them a little while to figure out it takes a little longer to get ready, and so by the 3rd or 4th century, that 2 or 3 day season of preparation that we call Lent had expanded to 40 days, but it was still really only for those who were about to be baptized, and by the 5th and 6th century, it becomes a 40-day season for the entire church. So it's been around forever, not just generations, not just centuries, but awfully close to millennia. It's, I think, a crucial part of our calendar as followers of Jesus. Now, here's kind of how it shows up for a lot of people. A lot of people, and for a long time, have used Lent as a season for fasting, right? We give up things that perhaps kept us from being who God made us to be, or we give up things that we feel like we've come to rely upon, when in reality, we ought to be relying upon Jesus. Somebody said coffee. I mean, I don't know. I've had 10 cups this morning, but perhaps if you're relying on coffee as a daily chemical supplement to your well-being, then Lent is an opportunity. It's not me. I mean, it's somebody else. Perhaps Lent is an opportunity for us to give that coffee up, not as a demonstration of my willpower, right? That's not what Lent is. It's not how strong can I be, right? We give things up. We fast from things so that we can do 2 things. Remember the sacrifice that Jesus made. We're going to sacrifice something that's important to us so that we can remember the sacrifice that Jesus makes on the cross. And because when we give up something that we've come to rely on, we remember that it is God who provides daily for our every need, physical, emotional, spiritual. So that's what fasting does. And that, for a long time, is what Lent has meant for a lot of people. More recently, a kind of new practice has been to take some things on during the season of Lent, right? We want to take on a new practice, a new discipline, a new spiritual discipline that puts us in closer proximity to Christ. It puts us in closer contact with God so that we can remember who He made us to be, so that we can live the lives that He's calling us to live. So some people fast, they give up. Some people add, they take on. What I want to challenge our church to think about this year is collectively, together, that we might take on a practice during Lent together. Now, that's one side of the thing. The intersection is with who God made this church to be, who we believe God is calling our church to be. Some of you may remember at the beginning of 2023, about 12 months ago from this Sunday, I think, we did a survey in church together that talked about, how well do we know our neighbors? And we started talking about neighbors. We've been talking about neighbors for 12, 13, 14 months now because we believe that God is calling us to connect our neighbors with the hope of the gospel, right? We want to connect with them in a meaningful way because relationships are how we're built, how we're created. We want to connect with those neighbors who are particularly lost and lonely, those who are despairing, those who are cynical about the church, those who are cynical about institutionalized religion. We want to connect with the 3 out of 4 of our neighbors in Peachtree City who don't have a connection to a church. We want to connect our neighbors with the hope of the gospel, and that hope of the gospel is not a wishfulness. It's not, gosh, I hope things go well. Right? The hope that the gospel speaks to is a robust and confident hope that the world will be set to right. Right, that God will return, that God is continuing even now the work that Jesus began to bring about the kingdom of God on earth. We believe that's who God called us to be. And one of the ways that we feel called to deliver that hope to Peachtree City and the surrounding communities is by planting 50 new neighborhood groups over the next 4 years, now 3 years. So we did this survey to get to know, well, how strong is our current connection to our neighbors? And I want to do it again. I know, let me say, before we put it up there, let me just say this. I know for some of us, technology is hard. It's frustrating. I know that it is the spawn of Satan, and so I apologize. But I think this is going to be efficient, and so I want you to take your phone out. This is what we're going to do. We're going to take your phone out. We're going to use something called a QR code. Many of you are familiar with the QR code, but if you take your phone out, you turn the camera on, and if you point it at the screen, go ahead and put the screen up. Yep. If you point it at that screen, a link will appear on your phone. If you'll click that link, all this is anonymous. This isn't collecting your information. All this is anonymous. The link will appear. Click the link, and it will take you to a 1-question survey. Here's the question. Out of the 8 closest neighbors to you, and think of a house as one neighbor, right? The house across the street is not the 16 children that live there. It's the one neighbor, right? Think of the 8 closest neighbors. Out of your 8 closest neighbors, how many meaningful interactions have you had with your 8 closest neighbors? 1 to 2, 2 to 3? Well, let's see, 1 to 2, 3 to 4, 5 to 6, 7 to 8. Go ahead to the next screen real quick because you get to see kind of how folks are responding to that. So we did this survey last year, and I got to tell you, you people lied. I'm telling you, you didn't tell the truth. So I am curious this year to find out if we are ready to tell each other the truth. Do we trust each other enough to tell each other the truth? Because last year we did this survey, it was like 85% of you knew every neighbor within a 3-mile radius. And I was like, I don't think that's right. But anyways, so here it is again. I think we're telling the truth. This same thing happened in the 9:30 service. That's fantastic. So about half of us have had a meaningful interaction with 1 or 2 of our neighbors. A quarter of us, 3 or 4. 13% with 5 or 6. 12% with 7 or 8. So we're making progress. I don't count last year's survey because I think maybe we misunderstood the assignment. This feels right. And the reason we look at this is not to cause shame and guilt, right? This isn't meant to make us feel bad about ourselves. It's meant to put some actual data behind, to put some actual action behind who God is calling us to be. If God is calling us to connect our neighbors with the hope of the gospel, we've got to actually do that work. Right? And so we wanted to just kind of see how we're doing as a church. So here's the intersection, and this is the question that's been haunting me for the last few weeks. And so I figured since it's been haunting me, I'd love to haunt you. So because misery loves company, right? So here's the question that I just cannot escape as we enter Lent. Lent starts this Wednesday. As we enter Lent, as we think about who God is calling us to be as a church, here's the question. If Easter is real, what does it mean for our neighbors? If Easter is real, if Easter's true, then what does it mean for our neighbors? Think about it. If Lent is a season of preparation for Easter, as we march toward Passion Week, as we head into the Easter celebration, if that's real, what does it mean for our neighbors? Easter is that thing. It is that event that transformed the world. It is the introduction of hope into our world in a way that it never existed previously. It is an invitation into eternal life, right? Easter is a participation. It's not just an invitation to eternal life. It is a participation here and now in the building of God's kingdom on earth. If that's what Easter is, if Jesus died on the cross to save us from our sins, to free us from our captivity so that we might become who God made us to be, if all that's true about Easter, then surely it means something for the people that we live next to. Surely it means something for the people who aren't just in this room, but the people who live where we live. Perhaps the answer to this question might provide us with a collective Lenten discipline that we might share together so that our understanding of who God is calling us to be might not be merely an intellectual or spiritual pursuit. It might become part of how we live in this world. My kids are getting to the point where the books that they're reading in English are interesting to me again. And that's a lot of fun. They're in 7th and 8th grade, and they're reading books. Some of the books that they're reading are books that I read as a kid and haven't read them in a long time, so I get to reread them, and some of them are books that I missed the first time through, and so I'm trying to kind of read some of the books that they're reading as they read them. I cheat. I listen to them on Audible, but it's just what I do. So one of the books that my daughter read in the fall was The Odyssey, and I think I read part of The Odyssey growing up, but I forgot all of it. And so I'm rereading it. I'm an hour from the end. Things are getting intense. Don't tell me how it ends. I think I know, but don't tell me how it ends. So here's my observation about the Odyssey, twofold. One, it's kind of a weird thing, the Odyssey. I can't keep up with all of the names, all of the Greek names. Could we not just go with like Mark or Bill or Phil or something? Like the length of the names, like Galifianakis, Budlakis, like it just keeps going. It's like 2 sentences of just one name. So please, could we calm down, Mr. Homer, on that? Here's my actual observation. It's a compelling read. If you're not familiar with the Odyssey, it's the story of Ulysses, who left his home, his wife, his son behind 20 years ago to go fight in a war. And for 20 years, he's been trying to get home, but the gods prevent him from coming home to his wife and his son. It is challenge after misery after challenge after misery. He cannot make his way home. Meanwhile, his wife is being courted by what is called the suitors, right? This huge group of men who want to believe that Ulysses is dead, and so they're courting Ulysses' widow so that they might marry her and take Ulysses' property. And his son, Telemachus, is not strong enough to protect his household, his estate, his mother. So Ulysses, at long last, the goddess Minerva, allows Ulysses to come home. But when he gets home, Minerva disguises Ulysses. He's this incredibly strong, like, picture of masculinity. But Minerva disguises him as like a diminutive old guy who smells bad, I think. I think he smells bad. So when he comes home, the suitors don't recognize that they've come face to face with Ulysses. Even his own wife doesn't recognize him. His son doesn't recognize him. He's disguised, and he goes into his own home where all these guys who are trying to marry his wife are eating his food, disguised as an old, weak beggar, and begs for food. Because he wants to see, what kind of guys are these? He wants to put eyes on them so that I think he's going to kill him. I don't want to ruin the end. But I think he's going to kill him, and so he wants to know how strong are they. I don't know. It's just a guess at this point, but he's been saying it the whole book, so I feel pretty confident in it. So he shows up. He says, I need some bread. I'm starving. Can you give me some bread? And the first guy that he talks to takes a stool and just whacks him in the face. Just no conversation. Just whacks him in the face. And it's interesting to hear Homer's reflections on that in the mouths of the other suitors, because what they say is, whoa, hey, I'm not even going to try to say the guy's name. I couldn't tell you. They say, whoa, hey, Phil, maybe perhaps you ought to hold on, because sometimes the gods disguise themselves. So maybe don't beat them to a pulp with a stool, and just be a little kinder. And that is an interesting notion. The notion that the person in front of you might not be who they appear to be is a compelling kind of idea. It's the kind of idea that shows up in cultures across the world for all time. I'll give you a couple examples. So Homer's writing about 700 BC, about the time that Israel's being exiled into Babylon. Well, 700 years before that, we hear a story in Genesis 18 about some angels who make an appearance, but they're disguised. I'm going to let you go read that story, Genesis 18. It's the same kind of story. The people in front of you aren't who they appear to be. 700 years after Homer, we hear from a letter that's written, we know it as the letter to the Hebrews. We hear a similar kind of idea. If you're not familiar with the book of Hebrews, it's a fascinating read that is focused on the superiority of Christ. And that's not language that we tend to use about Jesus. It sounds a little arrogant, sounds a little off-putting sometimes. But he stakes his claim, he stakes his letter on the fact that Jesus is superior to everything that the world has ever known. And he wants the readers of that letter to be clear. Jesus is greater than any power or any person that has ever existed in the world. And so the first two chapters talk about Jesus is superior to the angels. That's chapters 1 and 2. Chapters 3 and 4, Jesus is superior to Moses. Chapters 4 through 7, Jesus is superior to Aaron's lineage of priests. Chapters 8 through 10, Jesus' sacrifice is superior. It's a superior sacrifice of our great high priest. If you're not familiar with any of that, I really hope that you'll take the time to go back and read the richness that is the book of Hebrews. Fascinating, fascinating read. After the first 10 chapters, you get to the last 3 chapters, 11, 12, and 13, he makes a turn. The author makes a turn, and this is the turn that he makes. In light of the superiority of Christ, how then should we live? If Jesus is greater than any person or power that has ever existed, what does that mean for how we show up? And so these last 3 chapters are application and conclusion. And it's in these closing verses, the first 2 verses of Hebrews chapter 13, that we hear a familiar notion just dropped in, and then he keeps trucking on, right? He just kind of drops this little grenade and then just keeps moving on. And it's that little grenade that I want to focus on for just a minute. Let me read it to you. Hebrews 13, chapter 13, verse 1. Let mutual love continue is how he starts. In light of the superiority of Jesus, because Jesus is greater than anything or anyone that's ever existed, this guy's counsel is love each other. The word that he uses there is Philadelphia, by the way. Love each other like family. Love each other like brothers. Right? In light of who Jesus is, let mutual love continue. And then he says, don't neglect, and I think a better translation is forget. Don't forget. Don't neglect it. Don't forget it. Don't forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. Don't forget. Show hospitality. Show kindness is another translation. Show the kindness that you would show to a guest in your home. Show hospitality to strangers, those whom you don't yet know, because you never know when you might be hosting an angel. Now, are we talking about literal angels? Is this what the author of Hebrews is saying? Hey, sometimes the angels put on human body suits and they spy on us. I don't know. That sounds a little weird to me, but you have Genesis 18 that says kind of like, yeah, that happens from time to time. So that kind of freaks me out. I'm not sure if it happens or not. Either way, here's what I think matters. Either way, the author of Hebrews is pointing us directly to the intersection of Easter and neighboring. That person in front of you has value, sacred worth, whether you see it or not. And that's where the rubber meets the roads with the people, where the rubber meets the road with the people that you live next to. Because sometimes they do a really good job of hiding their worth. You know what I mean. They do a really good job of disguising themselves as the opposite of something lovable. But their worth isn't dependent on what we can see. We don't treat them well because of their affect or appearance. How we behave towards them isn't dependent on how they look or how they show up. Rather, how we treat them, how we're called to treat them as followers of Jesus, is dependent upon, it's determined by the fact that they have sacred worth in God's own eyes, that they are one of us, that they already belong to God. They may not know yet that they belong to God, but how we treat them is determined not by how we see them, but by how God sees them. Jesus, by the way, says the same thing. In verse 20, in Matthew chapter 25, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I hope you'll go back and read this. So keep track, Genesis 18, Hebrews, all of it, and Matthew 25. You got a lot of homework to do this week. I'm sorry. Some weeks are like that. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on here, but I want you to hear Jesus is talking about the same exact idea. Matthew 25, I'm going to start down in verse 37. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? When was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? When was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? And the king will answer them, truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these, you did it. Just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. Jesus is talking about the same thing that Hebrews is talking about, that Genesis talked about, that Homer accidentally landed upon. That the person in front of you might not be who they appear to be. Instead, it might just have sacred value and thus demand of us the kind of love and hospitality and kindness that the author of Hebrews is talking about. Jesus and the author of Hebrews are trying to change the way that we see the stranger among us. And not just the stranger who is the starving child on another continent, not just the stranger who is the homeless person in downtown Atlanta, but the stranger who lives next door, who is hungry for love, who's hungry for attention, who is desperate for help and for hope. So what if, as part of our Lenten discipline, we answer the question together? If Easter is real, what does it mean for our neighbors? Or maybe more precisely, if Easter is real, what does it mean for how we treat our neighbors? I have three things in mind, and I want you to begin considering. We're going to have some time for prayer here in a few minutes, because I want you to really consider whether or not God is calling you to take this on during Lent, because I want to challenge our church to take this on. But ultimately, I believe this is something God is going to call you to. So we're going to have some time for prayer. But there are three specific things that I want to invite you and your family to think about doing. Not thinking about, not believing to be a good thing, but actually do these things during Lent. Remember, it's not a Lenten belief, it's a Lenten practice. It's something that you do. So three things. One, will you pray for your neighbors by name every day? By the way, that does mean you need to know their name. I'm talking to myself. I struggle with that. Some of us know everybody's name around us. That's great. Teach me your ways. But some of us struggle with that. If I'm going to pray for my neighbors by name, I need to know their name. But will you pray for your neighbors by name every day as a family? Will you pray for their hopes and their hurts? Will you pray for their spirits? Will you pray for their bodies, for their health? Will you pray that they might come to know the love and power of Jesus Christ? Will you pray for your neighbors every day for 40 days? The second thing, will you serve your neighbors? Find some way to serve them. It could be a simple thing. It could be as simple as taking the trash cans back from the street. It could be as simple as dropping off a Saturday morning breakfast treat just because you can. It could be something that's more involved and requires more of a commitment. It could be taking them to a doctor's appointment. Right? It could be helping with a home repair that they can't do on their own. It could be providing child care while mom has to go to a work meeting that was unplanned. I don't know. Right? You can serve them in simple ways. You can serve them in profound ways. But will you find some way to serve your neighbor during Lent? And then the third thing is gather. And look, when we were thinking about this, the first idea was pray, serve, invite. But we decided that gather was a better term because here's what invite gives us an excuse to do. It gives us an excuse to say to our neighbors, hey, you want to go to church? No, thanks though. Well, I've done it. Well, we want your neighbors to come to church. We do. But that's not forming a relationship with them when it's the first thing that you say to them. Sometimes that opportunity presents itself. If that's where you are, then do it. But we don't just mean invite them to church. We mean gather with them. Get them together and have a cup of coffee with the neighbors on the left and on the right. Right? Invite 2 or 3 couples over for dinner. If you're a person who loves parties, host a party. I don't know. You could invite a couple people over for the most sacred of all social interactions, chips and queso. Right? You could do that. Somebody tried to make an argument that it was pizza and wings earlier. I don't think so. Invite them over. Gather with your neighbors. Do it in whatever way feels good and right and holy to you. If you're an extrovert, get a bunch of people together. If you're an introvert, don't get a bunch of people together. It'll freak you out. I would know. Just get a couple together. It will be okay. Will you pray, serve, gather? These are things I don't want you just to think about. I do want you to think about it, but not just think about, will you do these things? Can this be our collective Lenten discipline? Might this be the way that we answer together the question about how best to prepare for Easter? That we might take seriously Jesus' commandment to love God by loving our neighbors? Now listen, this is a heavy lift for some of us for one reason or another. I know you don't have time. I know it. You don't have to tell me. I already know because I don't have time either. Some of us don't have the bandwidth. We're taking care of parents and we're taking care of kids. Right? Some of us just can't right now, or at least it doesn't feel like that. So we want you to know that you're not on an island. You're not on your own to do this. This is what we want to do together. If we talk about doing this together, then I want you to know that the church is here to help with it.